working first. That looks okay.
Yeah, I can see that.
I was doing a school of ministry last week when, for the final hour, my screen went blank. And having asked for reassurance that they could actually see and hear me, I managed to deliver the final hour with a blank screen. A very strange feeling, kind of imaginatively imagining people behind my screen, and didn't puzzle out what it was at all. It was just something that happens. It's nothing to do with Zoom, I don't think. It was just something on the screen. But anyway, I can see some of you and I can see my PowerPoint, so I'm hoping that that's going to be okay. Just going to move the figures up a bit. Okay, the talk I'm going to give is in two parts. The first is some of the characteristics of Mark that I think you'll know, such as the kind of candid expression of Jesus' emotions. I'm aiming to, in a sense, present this in a way that will prompt your discussion. So I have a few verses that I'll share with you, and then I've suggested some words like Jesus' frustration or impatience, or and you might want to have a conversation about whether you think they're appropriate words or whether they're better ones. But what will be clear is that the focus on Mark during the year does confront people with Jesus' emotions in a way that the other Gospels don't quite do. In the second, I'll take a rather different direction and look at the work particularly of Tom Wright and Richard Borkham, and their view of the kind of Isaianic background of Mark and just what that means for how he presents both who Christ is and what he accomplished. I'm aiming to go for about 40, certainly 45 max, and I think we then probably have a break and some discussion groups, and then if we've got time or we can make time, I'll take some questions. I don't know how you normally do that. It may be that we can just verbally say them. It may be you might want to type them in during that period, and then I can have a little ponder ready for the end. But that's where we're going. So, preaching Mark. Some scholars have called it the orphan gospel because it was very much neglected in the early church. We only find about 3 commentaries that are extant from the first 1,000 years of its history. Very few people seem to think it was worth writing a commentary on, even the greats like Origen and such like, who wrote commentaries on nearly every book of the Bible. And one can see in some ways the reason in terms of what Matthew and Luke did with it. You will know that the majority of scholars think Mark is the earliest gospel, and both Matthew and Luke used it. In one sense, that's a compliment to Mark. But on the other hand, they clearly decided that it needed a better introduction. You can't really just write a biography about Jesus and then start when he's 30. So they added nativity stories, which of course we'll be rehearsing shortly. It also needed a better ending. The best manuscripts end chapter 16 with the statement that the women at the tomb didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. Not a very auspicious beginning to the spread of the gospel, that the only witnesses to the empty tomb at that point didn't say anything to anybody. And so they provide resurrection appearances. And it needed more teaching of Jesus, the sort of things that we naturally think about if we were asked, well, what did Jesus teach? We think of things like the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, such parables of the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, none of which are in Mark, but were added by Matthew and Luke. They also removed certain ambiguities. You'll be familiar with the story, I'm sure, of Jesus returning to his home place, And Mark rather abruptly and indeed rather confusingly pastes together two sentences, and he could do no deeds of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. It's not a very elegant sentence, an absolute statement. He could do no deeds of power there. Oh yeah, by the way, he did actually do a few, which Matthew combines into a slightly more elegant, and he did not do many deeds of power there. But more significantly is the abrupt language of Mark, and he could do no more deeds of power there, suggesting that Jesus was in some ways limited by the circumstances. He couldn't do any there because of the circumstances. Matthew changes it to he didn't do any there, and also gives you the reason, because of their unbelief. So Matthew paints the story as a kind of pearls before swine story. If they are unbelieving and unwilling to accept who Jesus is, then he's not going to waste his power on them. He chose not to do any miracles there, or not many miracles there, whereas Mark is a little bit ambiguous. He couldn't do any miracles there. I'll give you one more example. In the story of the man with the withered hand, Mark tells us he looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Luke, at the same point in the gospel, it's the same incident, says after looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." Luke has removed the emotional content of anger and grief and just told a story that is straightforward in that sense. A little anecdote for you. Just before I was going to preach a sermon once, the person who was down to read said to me, "How would you like me to read it?" Well, I didn't quite know what he had in mind, and I was wanting to get on with the service. And so I more or less just said, well, clearly and loudly. And he said, no, I don't mean that. It wasn't actually this passage, but the point carries over. He says, I mean, what sort of intonation of voice do you expect? And I was reminded of that when I saw this. If you were reading this out in church and you read, he looked around at them with anger, he was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, now what tone of voice will you say, stretch out your hand? Will you soften at that point because the anger is directed at the Pharisees? Or will you get the sense of Jesus is angry, he's grieved, and that will carry through for stretch out your hand? It was an interesting example. I have to say it's the first example, or only example, in about 40 years of preaching that anybody has ever said that to me. But of course, what was interesting about the reader's thought on that is that the way it's read out will affect the interpretation that the congregation get. And whether it's said here with anger or with compassion, that will make a difference. So, one of the major questions you might want to discuss in your groups a little bit later is this: is there value in highlighting Mark's often stark and ambiguous narrative when Matthew and Luke and most of later Christianity rewrote it, giving it a proper introduction and a proper ending and filling it out with Jesus' teaching and smoothing out some of the awkward parts or ambiguities? If that's what Matthew and Luke did, and most of the church has done it ever since, what value is there in highlighting Mark's often stark and ambiguous narrative? Keep that in mind as I go. The academic answer would, of course, be yes, because it is our earliest source and thus closest to what Jesus actually said and did. Academic books on the Gospels or on Mark will praise Mark's Gospel because it is our closest source. And so if Mark highlights, for example, some of these sharper emotions of Jesus, then we're more likely to say that that's probably what happened, or that's probably how it was, than the later accounts of Matthew and Luke. However, depending on your church, they might find that argument a little bit difficult to take, that Mark is somehow closer to the truth and Matthew and Luke have kind of watered it down. So there is also, I think, a theological answer, which is simply yes, because it is included in the Bible, and so its voice deserves to be heard. Here we're not necessarily saying you ought to get used to Mark because it's the best we've got, but simply it is one of the Gospels that the church identified as belonging to the canon of Scripture, and therefore its voice needs to be heard alongside the other Gospels, alongside Peter and Paul and Old Testament texts, etc., etc. So here's where you can, I think probably I won't say unmute at the moment, but just pause, scribble down if you've got any particular thoughts on these, and then share them in your groups afterwards. I've put a series of texts here which emphasize the emotions of Jesus. If we concentrate on preaching on Mark, what's actually there in front of us, the congregation will come face to face with Jesus' emotions. We've already mentioned anger. He looked around at them with anger. If you get that text to preach on, I expect you'll need some explanation of what anger must have meant to Jesus, and the implications if Jesus was at times angry, then perhaps there are forms of anger that could be appropriate for us. There are certainly forms of anger that are not appropriate, as we hear on the Sermon on the Mount, but there may be an appropriate anger at unrighteousness and injustice, for example. Secondly, amazement, and he was amazed at their unbelief. You probably wouldn't pause on this one, but it's interesting in terms of its implications that Jesus was genuinely surprised at certain things. People often think, well, Jesus is the Son of God, he's got supernatural knowledge, he knows all that's going to happen, so how could he ever have been surprised at somebody's answer or an encounter? But we often hear in Mark about amazement. Mark uses a lovely expression in Greek where he uses the same verb and noun from the same root. And so literally it's often, he was amazed with a great amazement, which sounds absolutely horrible in English. And I don't think any Bible translation puts it like that. We usually just have, and he was greatly amazed. Now, this one might be more debatable. Originally, when I wrote this talk, I gave some of it to two friends in church who are exploring vocation. And I gave this the title, Impatience. It's the story of the epileptic boy. You might remember that the disciples try and heal him and they can't. And so the father comes to Jesus and in a sense complains that I brought him to your disciples, but useless bunch they were, paraphrasing the text a little bit. And Jesus then says, you faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me. Originally, I'd put impatience here. I was persuaded by them that maybe exasperation might be a better word. But whatever it is, it's probably not an emotion that we often think of in terms of Jesus having. I get exasperated with my grandchildren. In fact, did so about an hour and a half ago when I was trying to get their bath ready before I came here. But we don't expect Jesus to be exasperated. We expect him to rise above it. And yet here is an example of exasperation. Frustration. Again, you might feel there's a better word than that. The fig tree incident. He says, when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And it withered. A complicated point here is that Mark is well known for adding explanations which don't prove too helpful. Matthew's account here misses out the for it was not the season for figs. And so we just have the story of Jesus goes over to the fig tree, there's no fruit on it, and so he curses it. And of course, actually, the story is symbolic for Jesus coming into Jerusalem and looking for fruit there, relative to Isaiah 5 and the vineyard. But here, Mark kind of feels like I better put in a little explanation, for it was not the season for figs. But of course, ends up by making it worse. Jesus comes over, curses the tree because it's not got any figs on it. And of course, he hasn't got any figs on it because it wasn't the season for figs. All in all, quite ambiguous. But I think you could see that this is frustration on Jesus' part, probably a bigger frustration about entering into Jerusalem and knowing what he's going to find. But the way Mark tells it anyway, a frustration about a fig not having figs at the right time or even the wrong time. I don't need to explore distress because the text says, and he began to be distressed and agitated at the beginning of the Gethsemane story. They've all got something like that, but Mark is stronger than the others. Jesus was distressed. I'm sure some of you would want to pick me up on whether fear is an appropriate word for what Jesus says in Gethsemane. Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Now, of course, we all know that Jesus went on to say, but not my will, but yours be done. And we congratulate him for that. We might miss, though, that Jesus returns a second time and says, Father, for you all things are possible, remove this cup from me. And so he steels himself with resolve to again say, but not my will, your will. And Mark even tells us, and he returned a third time and said the same words. So 3 times Jesus had to, if you like, steel himself to have the resolve to actually go through with not my will, but your will be done. Does that not suggest fear at what was about to happen, or at least some word similar to that? And lastly, again, could be controversial, doubt. Following that Gethsemane story on the Thursday night, as we celebrate it, Jesus, after praying 3 times to God for the resolve to carry on, finds it, and then a day later ends up on a cross crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a question. It's complicated by the fact, of course, that it's the first verse of Psalm 22:1, and some would think that is significant for interpretation. But certainly an ordinary reading of the text would suggest that the resolve that Jesus gained in Gethsemane after praying 3 times somewhat left him at the crucifixion when he doubted, my God, why have you forsaken me? So plenty of food for thought there as you discuss it, but what is clear is that if we are faithful to preaching Mark, we will have a number of opportunities at exploring, if you like, the emotional life of Jesus in a way that is less so in the other Gospels, or at least the negative emotions, if we were to use that term. When I preach on the Gospels, I quite often share these 2 portraits, both from the 16th century. One from Grunwald, his famous altarpiece, and one from Raphael. The fact that the angel in the Raphael is catching the blood from Jesus' side suggests that he has John's Gospel in mind, as John is the only one to mention that incident. But the difference, of course, is stark. We haven't got time to do it now, but quite often I will try and put these photos up and just ask the class for 5 minutes to reflect on what words come to mind as you contemplate each one. The Grunwald is quite clearly a Jesus who died in agony. Look at the fingers splayed out, the strain on the arms and shoulders, the torso that has obviously been struggling for breath, the scourged body, and of course the overall point that the Gospels make, that it was darkness. Contrast to Raphael's almost feels like the Monty Python version. It's bright blue sky, it's a lovely day for it. Jesus, yes, he's hanging on a cross, but he's hardly marked. He could have just come back from the gym. And yet this was a great painting, and in some ways represents the more victorious picture of John's Gospel. John's Gospel, in a sense, of course, is portraying theological truth, that throughout John's Gospel, the cross was going to be the way to Jesus' glory. It's followed by the resurrection, and instead of actually painting, as it were, the cross, how it must have looked at the time, Raphael combines that it was actually a victory, and the way that Jesus is glorified. Grunwald is closer to what you would have seen if you were there, although note, of course, that he's not beyond a bit of symbolism himself, with the lamb delicately holding a cross down at the foot of the cross. So both have got their symbolism. Raphael with the angels tiptoeing on the clouds there, and catching the Eucharistic blood. But interestingly, that they both come from within about 10 to 20 years of each other in the 16th century. One felt the need to paint a dark portrait, which is more like Mark's Passion. One felt the need to paint a more victorious one, which is closer to John. And even in the modern genre of Jesus films, we still have this contrast. If any of you saw Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, it's not an easy film to watch. When it was first came out, I was in Chichester, and I was asked by the cinema to come and give a talk following it, which I was glad to do, to get the in the end, I suppose there were nearly all church people there, but it was just nice to have a public event to be able to speak to. But I have to say, having been quite choked up in seeing the film, it was quite difficult to kind of get myself round to kind of speaking mode. But Gibson, of course, was trying to reverse what he saw as the kind of sugary Jesus films with Hollywood actors. And again, with this chap here in the film called the Jesus film, where again, he's hardly marked and looks as though he's almost dozed off to sleep rather than just suffering crucifixion. So interestingly, both in the 16th century and in the 20th century, the desire to produce both a crucified, agonized, tortured Christ and a much more accepting Christ still is there. Now, the connection with crucifixion is unfortunate as I move to these two individuals. If I had thought about it, I might have put in a different transition. But the transition in my talk is that I now want to just highlight two scholars who have, in a sense, insisted that we let Mark be Mark. Their advice, if you like, and then this is advice for us as preachers, don't judge Mark by what is absent. It's easy to pick up books and find that Mark has very few explicit references to Christ's divinity. There are a couple of references to him being Messiah, but very few in terms of his divinity. And there are very few explicit references to his atoning death. Certainly he died a martyr, and certainly it seems in some sense or another that it was on behalf of others. But Mark doesn't seem interested in speculating about any mechanism about how atonement may work. Both Wright and Borkham suggest that we judge by what's there, and if we attune our eyes, if you like, to seeing what Mark has actually written, we will find two very significant themes. Firstly, that Jesus is identified with the coming of God to his people. And secondly, that Jesus leads them out of exile into a new promised land. Now, where do they get this from? Well, it comes from Isaiah's New Exodus theme, which punctuates the second half of the book. You will be aware, I'm sure, that chapter 40 marks a new stage in the book of Isaiah. We've now left the 8th century and the Assyrian crisis, and we find ourselves in Babylon, where Israel has been 70 years in exile, but is about to be led out. Here are a few sample verses from chapter 40. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. When it's capitals like that, the Hebrew is Yahweh. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news, good tidings, excuse me. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord God comes with might. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. That is the themes that's developed then in the chapters that follow, that Israel can expect not just a Messiah, not just a servant of God, but actually the return of God himself in his glory, having left them in the exile period. He will return by way of the wilderness, make a way through the wilderness. God is returning. And how does Mark begin his gospel? The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. The messenger bit from Malachi refers to John the Baptist, and of course we have a bit of a description then of John in the wilderness, but the main actor comes on in verse 9. In those Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart. There's a verse in Isaiah, oh, that you would tear the heavens, and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased. So Mark's start sets up the identification that the new Exodus has begun. God is returning to his people, and who do we see who comes on the stage but Jesus, and affirmed then by the Spirit and by the Father, you are my Son, the beloved. And then this works its way out in some of the, I'm going to drop, I might come back to that in a moment, I'll go straight to this. In some of the events in the gospel. So the first public event of Jesus' ministry is this one. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Now you'll know the story, and of course Jesus forbids him to speak. He doesn't want the testimony of demons, but nevertheless Mark includes it because it is testimony to what he is trying to say. As soon as Jesus comes on the scene, the evil spirits recognize the presence of God. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Jesus forbids them to speak, but they know that God has drawn close. walking on the water story. Again, you'll know it. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, I'm sure most of us have thought of this as simply the human Jesus able to perform a miracle. But a number of commentators point out that Job 9 says, God alone stretches out the heavens and treads, representing the Hebrew, the Septuagint has walks, peripateo, and walks on the waves of the sea. So, according to Job, God alone stretches out the heavens and walks on the waves of the sea. And here's Jesus walking on the waves of the sea. And well, it goes back to Richard Hayes, actually, but Wright passes on via Richard Hayes. It has always puzzled commentators, this little phrase that he intended to pass them by. Curious in Mark's Gospel, Jesus sets out to help them. He sees them straining against the wind, and then Mark, somewhat unhelpfully, tells us he intended to pass them by and leave them to drown, presumably. But in that same passage of Job, Hayes pointed out this rather strange phrase, but look, he passes me by, or passes by me, and I do not see him. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. Now, you would never guess that pass them by would be an allusion to Job had you not been in touch with Job, because it's the only place that talks about God walking on water. And so Hayes suggests that it perhaps is why Mark puts in this pass them by, which is otherwise kind of incomprehensible. Hayes says this, and I'll read it, but I'll also pause because I think it's a significant phrase. He says, Mark, by refusing to trumpet the secret of Jesus' identity, instead signifying it through mysterious, symbol-laden narrative, Mark is teaching his readers to question and to listen more deeply before they start talking about things too wonderful for their understanding. One of the things Hayes is as a poet, he loves language. He's one of the experts in the field of the use of the Old Testament by Paul and the Gospels, which is my research area, so I know Hayes quite well. But I love those phrases. Mark does not trumpet Jesus' divinity. He doesn't have those I ams that John has, or those dialogues where Jesus says, well, the Father is working, so I'm working because we're one. He refuses to trumpet the secret of Jesus' identity, instead signifying it through mysterious, symbol-laden narrative, like this walking on the water episode. Something you might want to ponder. One answer could, of course, be, Hayes, your great mind has led you astray. You're seeing there what you want to see. Or maybe he's in touch with something. Is it one of the things that is too wonderful, the dialogue with the scribes about Psalm 110:1? You know, again, the story, Jesus says, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet, which is Psalm 110:1. David himself calls him Lord, so how can he be his son? And the large crowd was listening to him with delight. Nowhere in this passage does Jesus identify with the Messiah here. He doesn't say this was about me, or identify with the Lord said to my Lord, or indeed identify with who it is that sits at my right hand. As we read Mark's account, Jesus presents them with a riddle, almost like, you scribes, you think you know the scriptures. Well, how do you answer this one then? One part of scripture has David saying that the Messiah will be his son. Another part of scripture has him saying that he be his Lord. How do you reconcile those? And the large crowd was listening to him with delight as the scribes got their comeuppance, is what one commentator put. But as readers, when we get to chapter 14, we get to this. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And at this point, Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Here, Jesus identifies with, all right, if you put me on oath, the answer is yes, I am the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. And you'll see, if you like, Daniel's Son of Man seated at the right hand, meaning in a sense that you'll see me vindicated. I will be the one who is seated at the right hand, although even here you can see it's written in somewhat mysterious language. But when you get to this part of Mark, you will perhaps then remember, oh, okay, seated at the right hand, Jesus is claiming here that he will be seated at the right hand. Maybe he is the figure who is addressed to seated at the right hand in Psalm 110:1, and a period of reflection might then occur, as much as Hayes suggests. So is this one of the things too wonderful that Mark refuses to, as it were, put it explicitly, but teasingly has his own view of Jesus' divinity, which doesn't involve, if you like, philosophical speculation about different persons and such like, but in its own way, that Jesus represents Isaiah's prediction of the coming or return of God is just as powerful. And then lastly, just a few words about atonement. Isaiah 53, slightly abbreviated, reads, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." Christians down the ages have always felt the uncanny resemblance of this to the passion of Christ, and so have routinely treated Mark 10:45 as a quotation. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." At the level of thought, it looks like it summarizes Isaiah 53. And of course, our lectionary actually has Isaiah 53 read out on Good Friday. But Morna Hooker, when she wrote her book, Jesus the Servant, argued that linguistically, the case for suggesting that this is a quotation of Isaiah 53 is almost zero. Jesus talks about the Son of Man. That's not mentioned in Isaiah 53. There is a parallel about servant and serve, but they're different words. One uses doulos, one uses diakonoi. And Mark's key phrase for atonement is ransom, which doesn't occur in Isaiah 53. So in a sense, she argues, I mean, perhaps a bit tongue-in-cheek, if you're looking for linguistic parallels, it comes down to the words "for many" as the only actually exact linguistic parallel with the Greek version of Isaiah 53. And ever since then, a number of scholars have felt reticent in claiming that Mark 10:45 proves that Mark had an atonement doctrine, that Jesus came to die for our transgressions, the way that Isaiah 53 says. But Tom Wright and Richard Borkham both argue in this way. Jesus fulfills Isaiah's promise of a new Exodus. Jesus heralds the good news. Jesus enacts God's coming to his people. Jesus feeds his flock like a shepherd. I've not majored on that one, but the texts are obvious as to what they are. Now, Isaiah says that God's mission will be accomplished through the suffering of his servant. The reader of Mark will surely deduce then that this is Jesus, because he is fulfilling the Isaiah exodus that's promised. So Mark 10:45 only acts to confirm it. It's not the only evidence in the book that Jesus has or that there's an atonement doctrine. It comes really as confirmation as to what the reader will already start to be deducing. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So Wright and Borkham, if you like, reverse the logic of Morna Hooker's position in saying that the explicit quotations of Isaiah 53 that we find in the later Gospels, Matthew and Luke, and John as well, are not later inventions, which can therefore be dismissed, and the implication being that Mark doesn't have a doctrine of atonement, but they're evidence of how they understood Mark. They didn't invent the connection with Isaiah 53. They found it in Mark and then went on and made it more explicit, as they made many things more explicit. So their point about atonement is that Mark doesn't single out Isaiah 53 in order to explicitly proclaim some sort of theory of atonement. It's part of his view that Jesus fulfills the promised coming of God in Isaiah to lead his people out of exile into a new promised land. And the role of the suffering servant is part of that. Pause for breath. And here are some questions that might prompt your thinking. You can certainly ask and answer any other ones that occur to you from my talk. But firstly, keeping it practical, what do you think your congregation need to hear from Mark? I've given you some of the thoughts, some maybe more speculative than others, but what do you think will be the value of them coming to terms with what's in Mark during this year? Secondly, has this talk given you any ideas that you would like to follow up? I've presented certain sort of things. I expect many of you would want to, well, I'd rather go and study the commentaries and check whether I really feel I can agree with that, or it's raised questions. Highlight them now, and as you go through Mark's year, make a note of actually trying to follow it up. And then thirdly, simply, do you have any particular questions you would like to ask me? I don't know what your practice is,